Hello, everybody. I'm Ravyn, and thank you for listening to Akhetaten's Gates. As I mentioned in the beginning of the playlist, I am actually going to be doing a Q&A session. I have asked Arachne to read the questions out, and I will be responding to them. So, I hope you enjoy this, and I hope your questions are answered.
How did you think of smaller items for the book? Did you use artifacts as reference?
Actually, I did. There are a lot of things that were pretty generic and that you would probably see in any museum. But there actually were a few little things that I had actually seen in books, supposedly from the Amarna period. One of which would be the bottle that Akhetaten receives from his mother. While the actual piece probably wasn't owned by him, there was actually a blue fish bottle from the time period, and I found it very interesting. Another thing I took reference for is the statues of Tarouet and Bez, which are household deities for childbirth. That was actually something I had found in the research and had seen a couple images of. Obviously, the crowns, I did some research on the crowns to find out their meanings and such, so I knew which crown would be the right one for them to wear. There was also a small carving of baboons with regal attire, and while this exact figure supposed to be representing the royal couple were not actually quote-unquote shown in the book. General I does indeed mention a reference to these little carvings. It was a form of, I guess, political satire of the time from people who thought the royal family was not that great.
What was the inspiration to start this story?
Well, as I had mentioned in the beginning, I wrote it probably like my sophomore or junior year in high school. It was just something I really wanted to do. At the time, I was really into Egyptian history and Egyptian mythology, and it was just something I wanted to try. I have a particular interest in the 18th dynasty, but I didn't feel I was ready to write about Hatshepsut, which happened to be one of my favorites. In fact, I actually found a novel during a library sale that was all about her. It was called Child of the Morning, and it was by Pauline Dredge. And it was actually a really good book. I really enjoyed it. I definitely would suggest it if you can find a copy. So I decided instead to focus on my favorite couple in ancient Egypt, which is Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And it really wasn't as easy as I thought it would be because I'm actually dealing with real people and real history, and it took a lot of research, a lot of books, a lot of documentaries, a lot of reading articles, talking to other Egyptologists. It was really hard. And then after that, I had to do a lot of math to actually get the plot line I wanted figured out so I knew like in what year things would happen. It was just a really hard project and was something I wanted to try, and I could probably do better now, but for the time it wasn't so bad.
Are the characters different races? Is Nefertiti's black?
Well, there is racial diversity. You got to remember that Egypt was the center of the intellectual and cultural world at the time. So you have Greeks, you have Romans, you have Persians, other Mesopotamians, you have other African populations. So you have a range of different races of people. You can actually envision them as being pretty much anything, and a lot of them are, different shades of black or multicultural and so forth. Now, that being said, there are some who are specifically black, like Queen T is a dark-skinned woman. She is very black. And Troll Nurse is also very black. it can be assumed that her whole family is pretty dark in skin tone. As for Akhenaten, he's a little bit more of the reddish tone, but he's just a lighter black, but not as light as Nefertiti, which answers the question of her race. Nefertiti is technically black in the story. However, she does appear rather white. And that's not me whitewashing, that's actually what the depictions show of her. She is often shown as being very light-skinned, to the point of looking very white. And that is kind of how I see her, is what I've seen in her artistic portrayals. But I do recognize her as a very light-skinned black woman, rather than a white person, which just feels out of the ordinary. But yeah, she's not an albino or anything, but she is black, just extremely light-skinned.
Why did you pick to have the main character travel through time?
I would have to say my inexperience shows very much. When I had written the book out, I had normally wanted the time traveling experience to be something that would prepare her to be an independent woman. However, I kind of didn't do it as well as I should have, and it's very cringy now. But it was supposed to set her up for later, and then when I was doing the rewrite to prepare it for publication, I kept it in to explain why she spoke with such a modern tone, and why she would say some of the weird things that she says in the book. To be fair, I was very much intimidated by historical fiction. It was something I wanted to try, but I had read other pieces and they just seemed so dry and professional, and I wasn't sure I was able to accomplish that, but I wanted to tell a story. So it was pretty much a cheap shot. It was a quick way out to explain certain things, and I feel even then I didn't do very well, because it's almost never brought up again in the story. So it's hard to really imagine it really being that important if it's forgotten pretty much as soon as she returns to Egypt. I know it throws a lot of people off, and I totally understand, because I've read this book back several times, and even I just cringe when those chapters show up. So I get it, and I have since promised to be a little more careful in future books.
What were some of the ideas that were scrapped from the book?
Well, believe it or not, the novel was originally designed to have Akhenaten as the main character, and it was going to be from his point of view. So that would have been an entirely different focus. But I didn't feel comfortable doing it, and I'm glad I didn't do it. I decided instead to go for Nefertiti as the main character, mostly because there was so little known about her. Also, I wasn't really looking forward to doing all the research on the politics of the time, which I really didn't like. It was just really annoying. So it was hard to focus on his feelings, not being able to get completely into his world. Whereas with Nefertiti, like I said, it's not a lot that they know about her or did at the time. And I had a lot to work with. I had a lot of wiggle room to create a story within this mystery that she had. I have heard it actually said that it was like she just dropped out of thin air, and that was pretty much how she appeared on the scene. So I actually kind of used that to my advantage, although I could have done it a little better. But that's basically that part. I had planned on Akhenaten to be the main character, but it was Nefertiti, and I'm okay with that. I could focus more on, family and stuff like that. Another thing that was changed was in the first draft, Kia originally fell out of favor with the royal family. I don't quite remember how, but basically she had pretty much pissed off everybody. She had pissed off Nefertiti, probably Meridaten, because Meridaten kind of, she's kind of a little bitch. And then she basically made Akhenaten angry by this behavior, and he actually exiled her from the palace. He couldn't send her home, though, because that would create conflict, so he actually sent her into the desert to be left there. And when I was rewriting it, I actually found that I was kind of liking her because I was expanding more on the story, and she was a little more interesting, and then I, decided to get a little more merciful with her because she was the same age as Meridaten, and Meridaten was still seen as very young, and and I felt kind of sorry for her situation. So as I was actually writing, the characters themselves were kind of setting themselves up to go a different route, and I was okay with that. So I actually allowed for the story to change to such a point where Nefertiti and Kia actually end up befriending each other and able to deal with one another, and Akhenaten ended up not exiling her. And it made it more rewarding in the end when Kia makes another appearance near the end. I do kind of wish I had expanded more on that because I think she would have been an interesting character to actually work with. But that being said, I'm okay now with what we did, or what I did, and I consider me and my characters as a we. But I'm okay with, Kia surviving and not being exiled and actually showing up again later in the story.
Was there anything that you wish you would have changed or included in the book?
Lots, actually. I really wish I had the foresight to be a little more careful with the time traveling scene. I wasted a really good opportunity to incorporate it more into the entire story and to make it more of an interesting experience. So now it's all cringy, but looking back at it, I'm like, I could have done so much more with it. I also wish that I had developed some of the other characters. For instance, Akhetaten. Akhetaten was supposed to grow up besides Meridaten, and yet I almost never referred to her. I referred to her maybe like 2 or 3 times, and that was it. And looking back at it, I actually feel like I missed an opportunity to add more into the story as far as making it interesting and adding more silly mischief. There was a lot I could have done if I had actually followed through with Meridaten and Akhetaten growing up as, really close friends. But that's not the only case that I've done this with. I never actually dealt with General Ai's second wife. I didn't give Horemheb a whole lot of development. I also didn't give the younger daughters of Nefertiti a whole lot of development. Akhetaten was, I developed her a little more than the others, but even she kind of got less than Meridaten. As for, Neferneferure, Neferneferutin, and Sedapenra, they didn't get a whole lot of development either, mostly because I was more interested in the first 3 because they actually appeared a little more prominently in the history. But also not developing them properly, I basically took out all the sting of them being removed from the story. This was also the case for Akhenaten's sisters. More specifically, I probably would have developed Cinnamon a lot better. Because she was a fun character when I actually put her in the wedding scene, but just then, I refer to her like once otherwise, and I feel like that was a waste as well, because I think Cinnamon would have been a very interesting female character for Nefertiti to look to that was closer to her age, instead of always going to Queen T. Another thing I kind of wish I could have done was expand on the scene where they were playing Senate. Senate is a great game. I have actually been able to play the game. It's fun, it's simple, and it's one of the oldest board games in history. And it would have been nice to actually explain how the game was played to an extent. Like, not to go off and, and totally go off on a tangent, but it would have been nice to show I knew what I was talking about. But at the time, I didn't, because I published Akhetaten's Gates in October of 2008. And I didn't get to actually learn how to play until March of 2008, when I went to the King Tut exhibit being toured around, and it was in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where I saw it, and that's where I purchased my Senate board, and we learned how to play. So it was already too late, and I wasn't about to put any more money into it. I also think I could have handled the ending a little more differently. It kind of feels like I was rushing to finish it, and it wasn't even for the first round. Every time I had to work on it, by the time I got to the end, I was so ready to be done. And unfortunately, it does show. It's not as in-depth as the rest of the story. And it's a pity, because I could have developed a whole lot more on Kia, on Akhetaten, on Akhetaten, a little more on General Horemheb. It would have been nice to focus a little on them, so that, at the end of the story, you're more interested in what happens from here. But I didn't do that, unfortunately.
Was there ever a sequel planned?
At one time I thought about doing a sequel, but I just didn't feel capable of really writing a story that's based on the life of Tutankhamun and, his reign and what happened after his reign and so forth. I just didn't feel like dealing with all the stress and research and all that. But also, at the time, his cause of death was still up in the air. And even now, with a whole lot more information, I just kind of got out of the interest of it. I'm not interested so much in it anymore. I still like watching documentaries and stuff like that, but I'm not interested enough to basically immerse myself in it for the length of another novel. And I really don't think I want to write about real people again, if I can help it. There was going to be a novel called The Golden Rewind that would have focused on what would have happened if Tutankhamun had lived on, a sort of butterfly effect from there. It was going to be like a teen sci-fi novel. I had started thinking about it and started brainstorming it, but then I just kind of lost interest in it, and I didn't really have the time to really work on it, and now I just don't have the interest or motivation for it. Like I said, I'm kind of not into the whole Egyptian thing as much as I was. It was still a great part of my life. I really enjoyed the things I got to do and see while I was in it. But I'm over it now. I'm on to different things now.
Why do you hate the ebook?
When I first published this novel, the ebook option was not really available. So I only had access to paperback. And when I turned it in, the layout was fine. I had gone through it like 7 times before I sent it to be published. And then even then, they sent me a test copy. And I went through that at least 4 times. I worked very, very hard to catch every mistake that I could possibly find. And granted, there are a couple small ones that I found in recent years in the book, but they aren't that bad. Nothing I would really get upset about. However, I did eventually come to terms with ebooks, and I decided, maybe we should do ebooks. And eventually, the publisher ended up offering the option, and I said to go for it, and they just automatically switched it over, and I thought that was that. It was a while before I actually decided to finally purchase the ebook. I already had paperback copies, but I wanted the ebook just in case, But I never looked through it because I figured, it would look exactly like the paperback. The format was exactly the same. That's how everything else works. I mean, heck, even now when I publish my own books, because I don't use a publisher anymore, I self-publish, I always check to make sure that the two different mediums are the exact same layout and presentation. So I am aware of how it's supposed to look. And it wasn't until a while later when I actually went through the ebook to read the story to an inner circle and recording it and so forth that I noticed there were so many errors in it. I'm not talking so much about spelling, but like there'd be spaces missing so words would run together, or there'd be a period where there shouldn't be, and there'd be periods in between words, and it would be really formatted really weird. And at first I thought, how the heck did I miss all this? I had gone through it so many times, there was no way I would have missed all these very clear mistakes. And I looked into the paperback again, and that was fine. So only the ebook looked like this. But the thing is that I had waited too long, and if I had wanted corrections to be done in the ebook, I'd have to fork out more money. And I'd have to pay probably hourly for them to fix that. So to hell with that, not doing that. So it is as it is. I'm not spending any money on it. And I'm not dealing with it. I'm not going to republish it myself because then I have to get a whole new cover, and I like the cover, and the paperback's still fine. It's just the ebook. So generally, I don't mind if people would rather have the ebook copies of my books. I understand it's more convenient to carry around. It's a cheaper price, and that's fine. But I know that those other ebooks are generally good quality, and if they aren't, I would hope somebody would tell me so I could fix it if I haven't caught everything. But I usually go through it a few times to make sure it at least looks good. I do go through it. And in this particular case, since I have no actual control, I do still own the copyrights, but if I want anything done to it, I have to pay out to do that. That's what happens when you start with a vanity press. So don't do that. So now I don't pay anything anymore. So I don't get a whole lot of extra services anymore. It's there. I'm done with it. But yeah, buy the paperback. The paperback should be fine. Nothing wrong with it. Don't bother with the ebook because it's just a pain in the ass to read, and I look like a complete moron, which I find offensive because I worked very hard to make sure it looked good.
What were some of the most annoying things about the book?
The time travel. I mean, I didn't handle it well, and it's really annoying to look back on. I also had a problem with General I. Now, the story is told in first person. And the last thing that you want is a character whose name sounds like the narrator referring to herself. And it was really hard to keep trying to find context clues to separate I, as in General I, from I, myself, aka Nefertiti. I hated his name, and I really wish that I was able to change it, but the reason I didn't was because he is a very, very important and integral part of the Amarna period history. He's very recognizable. He's very recognizable during the reign of Tutankhamun, so I really couldn't change anything without screwing it up. I didn't really like the hymn to Aten. It is an official piece that actually was composed by Akhetaten, or so it said, and it's very lovely. I mean, to the point where, a psalm or two was inspired by it. But it was a pain to write, and it's even worse pain to read. For me, I mean, reading out loud. If you're just reading it, to yourself, it's fine, but reading it out loud was a pain. It has a very strange flow to it. It obviously was not originally written in English, so it sounds really weird in English. A lot of little things annoy me too. It's mostly like little minor stuff, but I'd have to say that most of my issues with the book is because of the amount of time that I've had to read it and the amount of money I've had to spend on it, and also a sense of resentment for it because I was not allowed to move on to create other things for quite a few years. Every time I'd try to move on, everybody wanted to focus on Akhetaten's Gates, and I was done with it. I was done spending money on it. I was, done trying to defend it. I wanted to write something else, and I wanted to try other genres. But being the fact that it's my debut novel, it was my first time actually going for it, so my inexperience was showing. It's very cringy. So yeah, while it's fine in and of itself, I personally have a grand dislike for it because of how much crap I had to go through with it. And I don't have this resentment for any of my other novels. Mostly because I have a little more control, and if something is messed up, I can just take it down, fix it, and put it back up, and within 24 hours, it's fine, I can't really do that with this particular book.
Are all of the Egyptian names in the novel based upon real people? Are they real Egyptian names?
Most of them are real names, yeah. Are they based on real people? Some are. Now, obviously, like the main cast of the story, all their names are real names. That's even including Amenhotep, the courtier, who we call Tepi in the story. Granted, his name was not Tepi in real life, but since we had Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV, and Amenhotep the courtier, I had to pretty much keep them separated. So third, fourth, and Tepi was pretty much what I wanted to do, to stay true enough, but to make it easier to realize who it was. As far as Tutmose the artist, while he probably wasn't as flamboyant as I created him to be, it is believed that he was a real person. I think he was a real person, and that was his name. He was said to be the artist to create the bust of Nefertiti that was never finished and is now in the Berlin Museum. The only name I can really think of that was not Egyptian and was completely made up is Hara. I don't know why I made up that name. I just like the way it sounded. So, there you go. A lot of the names, like I said, are real Egyptian names, but are not particularly real people in the sense. Like I said, Hara was a made-up character. I don't even remember if Sepenptah was a real person or not. I have a feeling he may have been, because I could have swore I've seen the name somewhere in one of the books when I was doing research, but it is possible he is. I don't know if he is. But people like, Sebekotep and Ani and, stuff like that, and Mekadamose, they're all characters that are made up or fill a role that wasn't completely described historically, and I just kind of threw names at them that I knew were Egyptian. So my thing was, if you can't tell which names are real and which ones are not, quote unquote, genuine, in the fact like you had the made up characters and the real characters, then I did a pretty good job. I do mention some other real people. Like I said, Amenhotep, aka Tepi. I, of course, was a real person. Horemheb, all the children, T's relatives were real people. Kia, obviously. But I really don't remember too many outside of that. I mean, like I said, the main royal family were all real people. All the big major players in the story were real people.
Were any of the characters' personalities based on real people or people that you know?
Sort of. I really only had one character that I based on someone else's attitude. I mean, I would have to say that I looked at Queen T's face, and I knew she was probably a no-nonsense kind of person. So I kind of based her on two of my coworkers at the time. I took their personalities and really exaggerated them. It actually worked out because she kind of had that no-nonsense personality from one coworker, but she kind of had that outburst, tendency to have an outburst like my other coworker. And it made her more funny to just kind of go over the top with that. Everyone else was more of a construct, but yeah, Queen T actually had a couple people inspire her personality. And she's the sassiest black woman in the story.
Who is your favorite character?
There's actually a tie for my favorite character. I would have to say it would be Queen T and Akhetaten. Both of them are very good at taking command of a scene and just making it totally over the top.
Would you ever want to revise the story and print a second edition?
Oh dear God, no. I never, ever, ever want to come back to this novel ever again. No matter how much better I could do now, I never, ever, ever want to do this ever again.
You don't seem to like this novel very much. Why is that?
Well, as I explained earlier, there was a lot of resentment due to the amount of times I've had to read it and not being able to move on when I felt I was ready to move on to other works. I could not move on to publish other works right away because everyone wanted to focus on Akhetaten's Gates. And of course, as I grew older and did manage to get more writing done, I began to cringe every time I'd think of it and look it over. Think of it like if you were a really, really good artist and you're like in college and you look at a picture you drew in kindergarten, you would probably cringe at how bad you were. At the time, you probably thought it was great, but you're probably kind of like, oh, God, it looks awful now. That's kind of how I am with it. I actually take a whole lot more joy with my other novels, and it's not as annoying for me to go back. And as I said, I have read this novel so many times. I'm just, I'm done with it. I'm bored. I've read it as many times as I could possibly read it, and if I read it anymore, I'm just going to start hating it more. The pride and luster of it is gone, and I try to avoid this book as much as possible now. Sometimes I even forget to mention it when I'm mentioning other books. I mean, like I said, it's fine to read if you've never read it before, and if you're into that kind of stuff. It's just, to me personally, I'm over it, because there's just nothing else I can put into it that I would be happy with. I am glad that I wrote it, but yeah, the charm's way gone for me.
Do you have any other novels following real people?
No, I don't think I do. Currently, everyone else in my stories are fictional characters, or they're from some sort of mythology or folklore, and that's as close as they get to real people now.
Do you have any other stories that are historical fiction?
That kind of depends on your definition. I do, yes. Poinsettia is set in Strathaven, Scotland in 1897, somewhat inaccurately. I did do a lot of research on the time period and a little bit of Strathaven, but I had to take some liberties in order to make the story interesting. That, of course, was an adventure in and of itself. I also have a few period pieces. I am not entirely sure if they count as historical or specifically just called period pieces. And most of them are short stories. They're normally set anywhere from 1940s to the 1990s. There is one particular novel that is in the works currently, and it takes place in 1982. It's really hard to imagine, I am someone who was born in 1982. And it's really hard to look at things from the 1980s to 2000s and see it as historical or a period piece. I have to keep reminding myself that the way that I felt about the 1940s all the way up to the 1970s are pretty much how kids today are seeing the 1980s and 90s.
Have you ever been to Egypt?
No. At one time, I would have loved to have had the experience to go, but nowadays, I just don't think I want to bother. I'm sure it's still really amazing to look at. There's a lot of beautiful things there. I'm sure there's a lot of experiences. There's the Cairo Museum. There's a lot of great things there, but I just don't think I want to deal with it. I'm just happy looking at pictures and watching videos and documentaries and stuff.
What is Tinit?
Well, as I said earlier, Tinit is a board game from way back in the days of ancient Egypt and is still played today. Now, you play with a set of sticks, although you can play with dice as well. The thing to remember is that in Tinit there is no 5, so you can't move 5 spaces. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. And I personally enjoy playing with the sticks. You have sticks with a flat edge and a round edge. And depending on which side it lands on determines your move. The board has about maybe a dozen blocks, and those are the spaces. You get 2 sets of pieces. Normally, you get like the incense and the spool, but they can probably be different. As long as it's 2 different pieces, and you get a certain number of those. Basically, you have to get all of your pieces. I think there's 6 pieces. You have to get all 6 pieces off the board before your opponent. But it's not that simple. There are traps on the board. Some are safe places, and some are portal places. Like, they're supposed to be like water places. And if you hit the water place, you have to start back at the beginning again. Whereas the safe places, you cannot be bumped or anything like that. Now, if you are set your piece and another person's piece, you can actually jump that person and just move on. If there's 2, you can't jump them because that's considered a fort or something like that. There's also, if you get to a point where your piece would eventually run into the other person's piece, like if you got a 4 and you move 4 places and in that 4th spot is your opponent's piece, you can switch those pieces around and put where you start, that's where your opponent will be placed, and you'll go where your opponent was. So you're sending them backwards. If you cannot go forwards or skip anybody or anything like that, if you're pretty much trapped and you have no other places to move, you have to move backwards. So there are complicated ways to play it. I'm sure online there are different ways to play it as well, but this is how I was taught to play. This is what the instructions taught me. And it's fun to play sober. And why do I say that? Because Tinit lounges were normally a place where people would play Tinit all day and drink. It was something that you would do while you pretty much consumed copious amounts of beer. I got tipsy once and played it. So it's definitely fun when you're tipsy, because you're all laughing at each other. But I never actually played drunk, But it is a fun game. And I do wish I could have gone back and put more information about it, but the book had already been published. But definitely, I would definitely say if you are into board games or you want to play, go ahead and look for a board. You can probably purchase it online, or you can find an online version of it. And it's a fun little game.
Have you ever tried to associate the novel in museum gift shops?
I did. In March of 2008, when I went to the King Tut exhibit tour in Atlanta, Georgia, I actually got to really enjoy the tour. There were so many awesome things, and not just King Tut stuff, but there was everyday Egyptian stuff. There was a colossal statue of Akhetaten there. Heck, there was even an ancient toilet seat there, and there was the box that Tutankhamun's stillborn daughters were in, and lots and lots and lots of cool things. One of my favorite things was a golden fan that had ostrich feathers in it. Of course, the ostrich feathers aren't in it anymore, but getting up close to it, you can actually still see the very well preserved fibers in there. It looks, those ostrich feathers, the little fibers that are in there, they don't look that old at all. They look like they were just put in. So it was really, really awesome, but I digress. We got to the gift shop at the end, and we purchased our Tinit board, and I had actually attempted to ask them if they would associate Akhenaten's Gates with the King Tut exhibit, because they are both in the Amarna period, and King Tut came after Akhenaten and Smenkhare. So, yeah, some characters from the book are actually characters in that part of the history as well. Unfortunately, it was never picked up. They did, we did pitch an offer. They just never picked it up, and in the end, while I was a little disappointed, I'm kind of glad that it wasn't, because I probably would have felt really weird now knowing how it wasn't. I mean, at the time it was my best work, but looking back, it'd be like, that is not my best work currently. It's actually not very good to me. I mean, like I said, everyone else seems to enjoy it. I just particularly don't. So I'm kind of glad it wasn't, but I do still suggest, if you're still into that, if you're curious, go ahead and get a copy of the book. Maybe you'll enjoy it if you haven't enjoyed it already via YouTube.
Why are there more powerful female characters than male characters?
That was kind of a whoops, mostly. I had never really intended to write women's fiction. I just kind of wrote it how it came to me, and I just figured Queen T was a very strong woman. I figured Nefertiti was very stubborn. And I figured her kids were somewhat the same. While I did want them all strong, I suppose it just sort of happened that way. Part of it was for humor's sake, and part of it was for dramatics. And it wasn't until afterwards, when it was pointed out to me that it was a great piece of women's fiction with female empowerment, that I actually started calling it that. I'm like, it is women's fiction, technically. And while I didn't intend for that, that is what it is. And so I just kind of rolled with it, and, I'm okay with that.
Aside from the time traveling stuff, would you ever consider the story historically accurate?
Partially, not entirely accurate. I did do a lot of research for it, so a good chunk of it is fairly accurate, considering the style. Like the years that the children were born, their names, stuff like that. Hymn to the Akhetaten was a real piece. Other parts were obviously made up, and I did tweak some other things to make them a little bit more impressive. I definitely took a lot more liberties for the story to make it more interesting and to explore some of the theories that were out there. Now, that being said, I always intended to be a little off with the history. While there is a lot of it that's like, okay, well, that's where the math comes in. I wanted to make sure certain things happened in certain years so that it all added up. But then I wanted some things just to be a little over the top, because I wanted people to be interested enough to do the research for themselves. If it was an interesting book, I would like to think that readers might be inspired to look up more about Nefertiti and Akhetaten, maybe Akhetaten, or maybe, General I, maybe Amenhotep III, maybe even Hatshepsut, the 18th dynasty in general, or other parts of ancient Egypt. I wanted people to become interested and to read many, many good books and watch many, many good documentaries on the subject.
Would you ever want to see the story made into a TV show or movie?
I would, but I would prefer it to be a movie. I mean, there are a lot of interesting things being done with TV shows these days, but I just don't think I would want to stretch out Akhenaten's Gates and then, risk losing too much of it to keep the ratings high. I think I'd rather just have a movie so it would be made and have it gotten over with, so that, you have it, there it is, it's over, you can go on to something else. So that sounds awful to say. I'd want the whole story done in one film. And I'd want that film to be really, really good, rather than have it done with a very low budget and episodic nonsense. There is really nothing in the story that would really cover a good episodic route. I mean, unless you just wanted it to be a really small mini-series, in which case, maybe, because then it would have a definite beginning and a definite end, and you wouldn't be stretching it out for ratings. I would focus more on the story and less on the marketing, you know what I mean? I just don't feel like Akhenaten's Gates has what it takes to be told in that manner if it isn't a mini-series to kind of keep it together.
If there was a TV or movie version, do you have any casting in mind?
That's actually a tough one. I don't really have a full cast in mind. I'm not really entirely familiar with all the actors and actresses. I have a very terrible memory when it comes to them all. Like, I can imagine Halle Berry maybe playing Nefertiti. Maybe, like, in her sweet spot years, like her early teens. Well, not early teens, but you know what I mean, like in her teenage years or something like that, or her early adulthood. I don't know. Of course, then again, it depends on how youthful you can get Halle Berry to look. She seems to have darker skin than what I would picture for Nefertiti, but she's still very light skinned, and she has a really nice face that I think would really be nice for Nefertiti. I think for like an older Nefertiti, I would actually think of someone like Felicia Rashad. And yeah, if you're not familiar, she played Claire Huxtable on The Cosby Show. I mean, she's kind of getting up there now, but she still has a very pretty face. She has that same light skin, darker than what I imagined, but still light enough that, it's okay. I don't really have anybody else in mind as far as most of the characters. I do think maybe, like WWE wrestler Kane for like General Horemhead. I don't know why. I just see him as this really big guy. The weird thing is that I should probably think of someone like, like Mark Henry or something, to make him darker. But for some reason, I just see Horemhead as a very light-skinned individual, and I don't know. I just think that it would be really cool if like, he was played by Kane. I have to say, I couldn't really find anyone in particular that I liked for Queen T. There are a lot of really beautiful, dark-skinned actresses out there. I mean, they are gorgeous, but the problem is that when they look so nice and youthful and, gorgeous and flawless, how am I supposed to judge for a queen, for Queen T? Because Queen T is kind of ragged in the story. She's old, she's got the bags under her eyes, she's got wrinkles, she kind of has a scowl a lot of the time. But I imagine, that's something I would have to see, audition for, and costume for. I couldn't just pick somebody, just looking at them. I had to say the funniest thing, though. The funniest person I had in mind isn't even an actor. I just thought it would be so funny. And it was actually something that I came upon recently, I think while I was recording the earlier chapters. And that was that Akhetaten should be played by Barack Obama. At least the older version of Akhetaten, throughout the second half of the story, I guess. But like I said, I know he's not an actor, but over the last year of his presidency, I just noticed all these little expressions, and he just came off as very charming, and I thought that those charming features would be very nice to see on Akhetaten. And I think he would probably do well. He has the right balance of being silly and being serious, and he has a lot of charisma. And I just think, that would translate very well for the character. So while it may not technically count, I would definitely imagine Barack Obama as my older Akhenaten. But those are all I really have. So, do with that what you will. Anyway, thank you for your questions. And I hope I answered them in a satisfactory manner. And thank you for listening to Akhenaten's Gates. Don't forget to leave a review on Goodreads or Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever. Definitely on Goodreads. If you want to own a copy for yourself, go ahead and get yourself a copy. And I just hope everyone really enjoyed the story or plans to enjoy the story. So thank you very much.